Hey everybody, it is Saturday afternoon and it's time to take another trip around the world. It's been a few weeks since I've done one of these. I had a minor back injury and I've not been able to stand on my feet for any length of time, and considering these videos usually run at least 15 to 20 minutes, sometimes much longer than that, I've not been up for making a trip all the way around the world. So let's see if we can get through it today. We got a lot to talk about and a lot to go over. My 29-gallon miscellaneous tank. Not a lot going on in here, but if you'll notice, it looks a lot greener than usual. And that is because I took this big chunk of Java out of my Gudgeon tank. It had been uprooted by the T-bar when the T-bar used to be in that tank, and it was just sort of floating towards the surface with the roots at the top. So I pulled it out of there. There's more than enough greenery in that tank anyway, and here it is in this 29 miscellaneous, and so far it looks pretty good. It's a very low maintenance plant, doesn't need a lot of light, doesn't need a lot of nutrients, so just being sort of gently pinched between the rocks down there should do just fine, and provided there's no big shock with any adjustment to the water, this tank should have a nice little additional bit of greenery in there, which will be nice. I don't really ever have a lot of success at growing plants in this tank. Other than that, all I did was top off some water in here today, and then I wiped down the outside of the tank. I did go around earlier with my Windex and I cleaned off the surface of the tanks. A lot of them had drip marks and stuff on them, so I got everybody spruced up a little bit today. But that's about it for this tank. My Gourami tank has not a lot going on, but I did recently add some bala sharks to this tank, and I recently lost some of the bala sharks that I added to this tank. I do need to get in here and do a water change. I really need to get in here and clean up some of the plants. As usual, it's like a jungle in this tank. The red tiger lotus over here is getting out of control. I got a bunch of them floating up on the surface again, so I'll need to get in there and remove some of those. And then, of course, this water sprite over here always grows like mad. And now that I don't have a lot of gouramis in this tank munching on the roots anymore, the root systems are starting to develop and get nice and thick and lush again. But all in all, as usual, the tank is very dark. And it's just because there's so much plant cover that the light really doesn't penetrate all the way down to the bottom. As far as the sharks go, I'm not sure why I lost them. I did shoot a video this morning about my water, and I mentioned the sharks in that video, and I spoke about how I have sodium ions in my water and so on and so forth. I'm not going to get into that again now, but that really shouldn't impact the sharks all that much. They're a very hardy, durable sort of fish. They really seem to enjoy getting in the back of the tank where that power head is and just getting in that current and moving around. I'm guessing you can see those little flashes of silver there in the back of the tank. But that's where they spend most of their time, so I hardly ever see them anyway, except for little glints of silver. So I'm not really sure what happened with the other ones or why they died, but I still have 3 in here. I started with 6. I lost all 6 of the originals, and these are 3 more that I ran through quarantine, but I ran them in a quarantine with some RO water, and I did a few other things to sort of ease them into being in my odd water. So maybe they will survive some sort of length of duration in this tank, and we'll be able to watch these sharks grow up until they outgrow this tank, which they inevitably will if they survive, because they get very big. I am aware of that. They will find a new home as they grow. So other than that, not a lot is actually going on in the tank. I got stuff I've got to do to the tank, but not really much changed within the tank other than the sharks there. So we will move right along to what I'm now calling my T-bar tank. I think the last time I did one of these round the world updates, this was still my angelfish tank. If you are one of the people that only gets caught up when we do these updates, you've missed quite a lot, so I'll try to make sure I cover everything. And then this tank pretty much was my angelfish tank, and I tore it down completely. I stripped it all the way down to bare glass and nothing in it except fish and water. I selected which rocks I was going to put back in. I put new substrate in. Repositioned the rocks. I put some of the plants that were in there back in, and got rid of some others, and then I added this piece of wood. I also took out the original piece of wood that was in the tank. The other big change I made to this tank was I added my T-bar cichlid to this tank from the Gudgeon and T-bar tank. I also shot a video on this fish not long ago debating whether or not this was a male or a female, and the general consensus by myself and most people is that it's a male, but there is still a significant amount of people out there that believe it to be female, so I'm still on the fence. I don't know myself. I'm going to say I'm 80-20 leading towards it being male, but I wouldn't be stunned if it turned out to be female. At any rate, that's really all that's going on in this tank, other than the big change I made, but that was several weeks ago. As I said, it's been a while since I've done one of these round the world updates, so if you're that far behind, then yeah, that was the big change. But if you're up to date and you know this is now my T-bar tank, then there's nothing really to talk about with this tank. Just a nice little look at it here, and then we will move on. My Black Ghost knifefish tank. Not really anything to talk about in this tank either. I did a water change recently. I got in and I wiped down the glass, and I physically removed a little bit of the green slime cyanobacteria stuff. I'm never 100% positive what it is. When I have the cyanobacteria that grows in my other tanks, it's very recognizable as sort of this green film. It comes off in sheets. It doesn't grow like fuzzy and stringy and sort of hairy like it does in this tank. I got rid of most of it, but if you see that right there, see how it's kind of hairy on the very tip of that leaf right there? It sort of flows in the current. I get stuff like that, and if I don't keep it in check, it gets, several inches long. It's actually really pretty in a weird sort of way. And it looks to me more like maiden's hair algae, which is a filamentous algae, or like a strand algae. So you can see a big chunk of it back there on the top of that wood. That does not look like cyanobacteria to me. And I've treated this tank for the cyanobacteria so many times, and it just comes right back. So I'm beginning to believe it's some sort of vicious form of algae and not cyanobacteria at all. And while I may still have cyanobacteria in the tank, for example, if you look at that little clump of stuff on that piece of wood up there, that's actually a little dwarf Danubius, and you can see that green just underneath where that Rasbora was sitting. That looks like the cyanobacteria. It's just sort of a little green sheet. I could probably peel it off in one piece. That, to me, looks like the cyanobacteria. This other stuff that grows in these long, fuzzy strands does not. So I'm not entirely sure what I'm dealing with in this tank, but I did get in there and I physically removed a lot of it with a siphon and with my bare hands. I just picked a lot of it off of everything, and I wiped the glass down a little bit, but other than that, I did not treat for it again. I will also add that the big chunk of fern right there in the middle that's attached to that wood, a lot of that broke loose and sort of came off. Some of the root looked like it was dying. So that got sort of inadvertently pruned down or trimmed down, and I'm hoping if I got rid of some of the dead junk, it'll clear some space and we'll get some new growth on that piece of fern right there, and we'll get some nice bright green going on in the tank again. I guess that was a lot to talk about, even though I said there wasn't really a lot to talk about going on in this tank. So long and short is, it's still the same maintenance I've always done to it. I'm not really worried about it. I am just kind of scratching my head as to why I can never get rid of the stuff in this tank, and whether it really is cyanobacteria or it's something else. So plenty of time to think about that and discuss that later. My native tank. Not really a whole lot going on in this one either. I did move the Chinese algae eater over to this tank when I was on the T-bar tank, now the T-bar tank, the one that was formerly my angelfish tank. The reason the angelfish died was because of the Chinese algae eater was chewing on one, my albino, and it did so much damage that it wound up dying. And I think because the other one was getting old and the stress and the medication I was putting in the tank, I think that wound up killing the other one. So long story short was I put the Chinese algae eater in this tank, and that's really the only thing there is to discuss for the most part. It's doing a really good job of cleaning the tank up. Oh, there he is. He's lying right in plain sight. I've been looking all over the place for it. You see it on that piece of wood right there in the back. So it's doing well. The crayfish aren't bothering it. It doesn't seem to be bothering anybody else. It's got plenty to eat in this tank. I do put more algae wafers in this tank now that I know this fish is in there, just to make sure it gets plenty of nutrition. And then other than that, all I'm really waiting to do is get rid of this Mayan cichlid, which I'm hoping I will do this coming week. Today is Saturday, so maybe Monday or Tuesday, Wednesday of next week, something like that. I should be able to get down to the fish store and we can get that Mayan cichlid out of the tank. I also need to get this green sunfish out of the tank right here, and once we've eliminated both of those fish from this tank, then we can start thinking about which direction we're going to move and where we're going to go with stocking, so on and so forth in this tank. I don't really know what we're going to do with this tank just yet. I did shoot a video the other day where I discussed what I'm going to do with it over the winter and what the stocking, the stock load is going to look like over the winter. So we'll have to wait and see on that. So not a lot really going on. This tank's just kind of hanging out, waiting to see what happens once we get rid of those two fish. So until we get rid of those two fish, not a lot going on here in the native tank. I actually do have something to talk about with my snail tank today. About a week ago, I decided that since I was never really growing snails in this tank, that the little ghost shrimp that were in here were the reason I was not. So I got in there, I did a big water change, like almost drained the tank basically. I got rid of all that Java moss that was growing in there, except some of the stuff that had attached to that piece of rock. When I pulled everything out, some of the stuff that had already attached stayed in there. So that'll start growing back, which is fine with me. What I was able to do was get all that nasty old stuff out. I got the shrimp out. I put that in Butterbean's tank, my puffer. He made short work of it. And now I have nothing but snails in here with no shrimp to eat their little eggs. So I should have an explosion of snails going on pretty soon. Now I've got really soft water. I've got no calcium at all in my water. So snails don't do well because their shells get so soft they just crumble. They need the hardness. They need the calcium. So I will add something in there. I'll either add like a cuttlebone, or next time we make eggs I'll throw the eggshells in there. I'm not going to go out and buy any kind of like aragonite sand or anything like that. I don't need that kind of hardness, but just something with a little bit of calcium in the tank just to boost the amount of calcium in my water. And of course with the eggshells, I believe the snails actually go down and work over the eggshells, and they probably get calcium that way, and then that hardens their shells up just a little bit. So we do actually have a few changes in the snail tank this week. Somebody asked me to do a video about them too, so I will probably do a video shortly here about how I raise these snails, although I pretty much just covered it. It's not really difficult to grow snails. You just throw food in the tank and snails grow. So moving on, we are at my Gudgeon tank. This one is still listed in the playlist as my Gudgeon / T-bar tank, or however I've got that listed. I never changed it. But the only inhabitants of this tank now are my Gudgeon, who just swam into the back, and I do have a rubber lip pleco in the tank, which is why this tank is so bright and shiny and beautiful and clean. The only thing really going on in this tank at the moment is the lighting is sort of out of whack. One of the tubes burned out in the forward fixture. I have two fixtures on this tank, and both of them are twin T5 units. And so one of the tubes burned out on this fixture, and if you'll notice how sort of yellowy that light is, excuse me, the only tube I could find lying around in the other room to replace it was a 2700K, which is a soft or a warm white, depending on how you want to look at that. But it's 2700K, and that's what's giving it that sort of soft glow in the tank and that sort of yellowish look, that orangey yellow look. So I have ordered new tubes. They will be here, I believe, Monday, if not maybe tomorrow. And we will be doing a video about changing that light out, and you'll get to see the difference between that nice 6500K, which is a nice bright white, lots of blue in it, and the difference between that and this 2700K, which has lots of red in it and gives you this much softer look. I have had people suggest that the Gudgeon will appreciate it more, having the softer light on it. That is true in one extent. It's also true that this Gudgeon has plenty of places to hide, and it spends most of its time down in the leaves anyway, so regardless of how bright the light is, the Gudgeon is almost always in some shade and some darkness. But the 2700K won't suffice for my plants. You gotta have more blue light in your tank if you want your plants to thrive. If you've got a very soft glow like this, if you're using 2700K tubes, your plants will not thrive the way they would under the 6500K tube. If you're using incandescent lights, you don't have to worry about that because you get full spectrum from the incandescents and they do just fine. But if you're using fluorescent tubes, you've got to use that higher color temperature number, that K number. Whether you understand it or not, doesn't matter. You need to use the higher number, getting up towards that 65 or 6700K to keep your plants looking good and healthy. This lower number, this 2700K that gives you the soft light, is just not a wide enough spectrum for your plants. They're not getting enough of the blue light for them to really do well and thrive. So those are the changes that are going to happen in the very near future. And I did mention before, and I'll say again, that the other big change that's going to happen to this tank is going to be that I'm swapping this tank with my Brackish tank. So soon this Gudgeon will be living in the 20-gallon tank that we'll be seeing in a few minutes, and my figure 8 puffer and my gobies and little Endler's guppies that are living in my Brackish 20-gallon tank, they will be moved over into this tank, and this will become my new Brackish tank. The only problem I'm going to have with that is this little grouping of plants right here is all temple plant, and that will not be able to tolerate the salt that's going to be in the water when I convert it to Brackish. All of this other stuff in here, all this is Java fern, and while it's probably going to suffer a little bit when I make the transition, it shouldn't die. We should be okay with that, but this temple plant is probably going to have to come out, and I may even take it out and just move it right over into the other tank when I do it, but that's down the road, and that's going to be another video. Moving along with this one. This, if we get over here where we can look at the whole tank a little more broadly, this is my 125-gallon tank. And the change I've made to this tank most recently was adding some greenery to this tank too. It's nothing fancy, it's nothing difficult or complicated, it's just some Java fern. Again, I've said before that I'm not real fiddly with my tanks. I don't feed them, I don't put ferts in them, I certainly don't do CO2 injection or anything. So I need real simple, low maintenance kind of plants. And that's what I grow. The temple plant, the ferns, mosses, these are all real easy to grow plants, and I just don't have to worry about it. And it gives me some nice lush greenery in the tank, and that keeps me happy. So that's all I'm really worried about. This tilapia, however, also likes the nice lush greenery in the tank and pretty much destroyed all of the floating water sprite and the temple plants and everything else I've had in there. So I'm now trying a bunch of Java fern in hopes that it'll be durable and tough enough that the fish won't be eating it. I do have a few pieces that have broken loose. You can see that one's kind of trailing. This one's no longer really tucked in under there properly. So I'll need to get in there and make a few adjustments to it. But other than that, everything is doing well. This is actually a type of fern. This is an El Nino fern, so I'm hoping that will do okay. I've had a few people give me some pointers on that, so if I have issues, I'll actually have a few ideas of what I can do about keeping that healthy. And I also put in this sort of chunk of Anubias rhizome, and while the roots look like they're doing well on it, I don't see any new growth popping out on it just yet, so we'll have to wait and see how that one turns out. I do have a nice bright green new leaf coming out on that one back there. That is some kind of sword. I believe that's some kind of sword. It might be an Anubias. I'm not sure. It's been in there for so long I can't really remember anymore. So that's all I've really got going on in this tank is the various plants that have been replaced. I did want to point out that someone had mentioned to me something about my beautiful cichlid here, and I thought that's not a cichlid, that's a tilapia. And I got to scratching my head that I don't really know much at all about tilapia, and I was looking at it and I thought, the colors on that really looks, colorful enough to be a cichlid. So I looked it up, and sure enough, there's something like 21 different species of tilapia, and they are all cichlids. So live and learn. I did not know that. So once again, thanks to a comment from one of my viewers, I now know just a little bit more about the fish I keep. I knew this was a spotted tilapia, but I had no idea tilapia were actually cichlid fish. Based on its behavior and its voracious appetite for vegetation, I'm really surprised that it's a cichlid. It is definitely an omnivore. It will eat anything I put in the tank. It loves the freeze-dried shrimp. It eats shrimp pellets, but it loves the plants, and it loves the algae wafers. And while I don't necessarily put all cichlids in the category of being vicious predators, they tend to be aggressive. I mean, even when we think about things like angelfish, we put them on the low end of the aggression scale when it comes to cichlids. And for an African cichlid, I know this is not an African lake cichlid, but it is still an African cichlid technically, and it is so mild-mannered, it gets along so well with the other fish in this tank, I never would have believed it was a cichlid. So I've just found that really interesting, and I thought I would share that with everybody in case there's anybody else out there that, like myself, did not know that these tilapia are actually cichlids. So, like I said, live and learn. I'm always learning something new, and that's a big, nice generalized something that was easy to learn, so I'm glad I did. Almost last, but not quite yet, is my Brackish tank. This is the tank I was just mentioning that will be converted over into a freshwater tank. The Gudgeon's going to come into this tank, and then everybody in this tank is going to go over into that 40-gallon tank. Again, not a lot to talk about in this tank. With my back injury, I just haven't been doing much. I've been getting down here and making sure everybody's been fed every day. I've been trying to keep up on some videos. I've just now gotten to the point where I've been down here doing some water changes and stuff, and we're getting kind of caught back up again. So, not a lot really to discuss with this tank. I have had someone ask me if that is that red cyanobacteria making its way back into my Brackish tank, and it kind of looks like it, but it kind of doesn't. It looks much redder on camera than it does to me. It looks very brown to me. I'm not really sure what that is or what's going on with that, but it is spreading around the tank, and I am getting it in patches, so it wouldn't surprise me if it's that red cyanobacteria making its way back. And if you've been with me for a long time, you'll know that I set this 20-gallon tank up because I had utterly given up on the other tank. I had tried to kill off that red cyanobacteria so many times that I just gave up on it. But it did not look like this. It looked completely different, and I don't think that's what this is. It could be some sort of red algae. I'm not really sure, but since this tank's going to get shut down and switched over into a freshwater tank here in the very near future, I'm not too worried about it either. We'll get this tank cleaned up when I change it over. I'm not just going to swap the water out. I'll remodel the tank a little bit. I'll plant it differently, and I'll get it set up a little more appropriately for that gudgeon and one single rubber lip to be living in here, and they will live in here together. At any rate, we will move on to my quarantine tank. There really is nothing to talk about in this tank this week. There's nothing in quarantine. The fish you can see swimming around are my female guppies. They've ended up in that tank just because I'm tired of sprouting guppies all over the place, so I have all the females in one tank, and they're just in there. They kind of live in this tank, and there's not really a lot that I can do with them. I got a few tanks that maybe I could put one or two of them in there. But whatever, they just sort of live in this tank. They keep it up and running. They keep it cycled by being in there. So when I need a quarantine tank, I have a fully functioning quarantine tank, and it's got my little female guppies in there. So last but not least, here in the fish room, I do have some more tanks upstairs, but I never include them in these around the world updates. I call these around the world because I do have sort of the ring of fish tanks, and we start and just sort of go around the world and end up back where we started. This is my red-clawed crab tank, and this is my most neglected tank. It is the one tank I have not yet been down here to sort of get caught up on. It's the next one on my list of project tanks to worry about. The water is clean enough. I haven't really changed the water in a while, but I have been using my RO water to top it off. And you can actually see the line where the algae is growing, and I topped it off with over a gallon of RO water, and we brought the level back up to where it should be, which is right around the edge of where this piece of wood is sort of half submerged, is where I like to keep the water level. This tank does have some of that red cyanobacteria in it, although now that I'm looking, I don't see it anymore. It's actually all gone, and I don't even smell it anymore. Now, that is interesting. As the water level was getting lower, I had that red slime cyanobacteria developing all over these rocks, and it was to the point where I was actually starting to have issues with it. I could smell it. The room was starting to get that musty, stinky, old, wet basement smell, and it comes from that bacteria. It smells awful. It really does. So it's gone now, and I've always associated that with salty water or brackish water. I can actually sit down here for a moment while we're looking at this tank. That is the stuff I used to get in my brackish tank, and only my brackish tank, and I've always wondered about that. Cyanobacteria is an extremely primitive organism. It's incredibly hard to kill off. It's a very durable organism. It's been around since the dawn of forever. Excuse me. And that's for very good reason. It's really, really just ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So if you've got an environment that it can survive, it's probably going to survive. It's just like algae. If you set a glass of water on your desk in your office, you let that water sit there long enough, it's going to turn green because algae is going to start growing in it, even in your desk in your office probably. You know, algae is just ubiquitous. So this green, or this red slime cyanobacteria is the same way. So if I've provided it with a place to live, it's going to take, hold and start living here. So now that it's suddenly gone, I'm wondering if the salinity is not the key. As the water evaporated and we got down to this level, the water got saltier and saltier, and that's when I was starting to see this, the red cyanobacteria crop up. And just a few days ago, I topped it off with RO water, which would have brought the salinity back down to about 1.004, which is where I keep this tank, slightly less salty than my brackish tank. This is the very, very bottom end of brackish water, and just like that, all of that cyanobacteria now just seems to be gone. So I wonder if reducing the salinity in the tank is not what took care of it. That's interesting. So now that I've made that little observation, I'm actually going to have to try to experiment around with that a little bit and see if that's not what the key to getting rid of that cyanobacteria is. That will be very handy for me to know in the future. Anyway, I've drugged this video on long enough. We're pushing half an hour here. I knew it was going to be a long one. We had a lot to get caught up on, but there we are. We have made our way all the way around the world. I did have to sit down for a few minutes there, but we made it. So we're back to where we started. This is my 29-gallon miscellaneous tank. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you stayed with me for the whole thing. If you did, thank you. And again, I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe. I always have something going on down here. As you can see, I got plenty of tanks and plenty to do and plenty coming up. So thanks again. See you real soon in the next one.